All right, Ace, welcome to the Jack Burden Show. How you doing?
Hey, thank you for having me.
Good. So I think, like a lot of people, I found you through a plug on AA's stream when he mentioned that you were kind of the main source for Thomas777 on YouTube. But very quickly, I realized that not only are you, like me, pretty young to be in these circles, but also there's a lot more to you than just, being kind of a sidekick on a stream. So how did you end up on the right? Like, what's your story?
Well, I wasn't politically engaged for most of my life. Obviously, 2016 was a big catalyst that got me vaguely interested, yet not savvy at explaining it really. It was more general ideas that won me over at the time. And then around 2019, the Pat Buchanan platform made me realize that there was a movement with authors and people that have portfolios, and it wasn't just an online thing. So there was real social capital that legitimized the conservative movement outside the neocon paradigm. So I owe my interest in politics to the paleoconservative movement who were raising alarms in the 90s. And if I could say real quickly, what really changed everything for me was realizing that William F. Buckley was doing the exact same thing that Ben Shapiro and the intellectual dark web types. And so I think a lot of young people like you and I are easily kind of susceptible to those kind of online personalities. And when you look at, exactly what it is, an organization like National Review, for example, you can start to see that people like that and those types of groups are exist to gatekeep the right and control the Overton window. So just seeing like a video explaining that made me it was kind of like a Wizard of Oz moment, just kind of seeing what a farce a lot of the DC scene is. So that's kind of how I got to be towards the right.
No, I definitely know what you mean. And I don't want to just turn this into me talking about myself, but I have a similar but slightly different path to ending up here, right? So I was thankfully raised in a fairly conservative community. My family wasn't, but are you familiar with the classical Christian school movement?
No.
Oh,
No.
so this is actually a a movement started very much in the kind of waters around Buchanan, not by him specifically, but kind of the same social forces which catapulted him to prominence were instrumental in this movement. But essentially, it's a movement that tries to kind of resurrect the intellectual Christian tradition. So, very great books focused, very much in the kind of Western canon. And so, even though my family was not particularly Christian, or not Christian, nominally Christian and also nominally conservative, coming from kind of a mix of blue dog Democrats and, boomer cons, right? I kind of swam in those waters and almost kind of through osmosis, kind of got a very odd mix of, you know, throne and altar Jeffersonian conservatism and a little bit of something else sprinkled in. And so, in a way, I kind of arrived to what it sounds like you did too, which is this kind of weird, like IDW Ben Shapiro moment. And before the stream started, we were talking a little about college, and we actually had seems like somewhat of a similar background. Both of us went to community college. Did you go straight to community college from high school?
Yes, I did. That was kind of my introduction to politics because was vaguely aware that as the reputation goes, California being hyper liberal, and so I got my first taste of liberal professors or teachers, and it was just kind of surreal that it was as real as the stereotype. And that's when it's one of those weird things, like you said, the IDW scene. I don't think a lot of young people are aware that they're part of that group. It's just kind of thrown onto them, whether it's through their social media or their YouTube algorithm. And so I was fooled into going towards that crowd. And then just the Buchanan stuff, as you said, once you see that stuff, it's hard to look back because you see that there's other more salient ways to be on the right instead of falling into that category.
Well, and something I've noticed it. One of the things again we mentioned before the stream started was the kind of the National Review conservative, and I kind of gently make fun of my of my fiance's mother for this. She, is not a very political person, but she loves David French. And every time she brings him up, I just have, think of the worst things to say about him, because I really do have a lot, like jokingly, but I do have a lot of disdain for him. And there's this, I think it's the force that leads a lot of young men on the right towards kind of defaulting towards libertarianism, right? Which is that it's this easy way to believe the things that I think that people on the right want to believe. That kind of hierarchy is a good thing, that this kind of a more traditional mode of life is something to be pursued. But you kind of get the cover of saying like, oh, I'm not saying it's normative, like whatever you want. It's like, oh, I'm not trying to force this on anyone. And you kind of get to put up that shield of social libertarianism, and in much the same way that Ben Shapiro somewhat laughably calls him a libertarian, it seems to be kind of like a popular funnel for people our age and with our general, proclivities, right? So I think I see a lot of people kind of get sucked into that as the quote unquote respectable way to be on the right.
No, definitely. And it's funny you mentioned the libertarians. I was just talking with my dad with like this earlier this week about how the 2008 election really is a good litmus test for like your political evolution, because I think the Ron Paul revolution, if people who are on that bandwagon, I give them a lot of leeway, because obviously their heart's in the right direction. They understand that the two-party system has its flaws, and then to choose Ron Paul over an Obama ticket, I think that those instincts are correct. And then and what another thing we talked about is it's a shame that and the Tea Party movement kind of fizzled out, because the boomers, I would argue the boomers just weren't tech savvy and they don't know how to sustain that kind of momentum. I think people like yourself and I and some of the people we talk to can easily revitalize that type of energy now that the digital age is sort of the default, whereas back then that was probably the early stages of social media and Twitter and so on. So I think there's a lot of parallels with the libertarian pipeline for sure.
We'll see. I think I might be slightly more pessimistic than you are on that front, but it's interesting. So I'm Gen Z, so in my early 20s, and a lot of my influences in life, my friends who are slightly older, they kind of came into political awareness through the Ron Paul movement. So even though that was something I was by no means aware of at the time, it's something that has shaped me kind of as a second generation, if that makes sense, even though that isn't a political tradition I necessarily want to like pin my name to. A lot of the people who informed me, came of age during that kind of like Ron Paul movement. So,
Yeah.
oh,
No,
sorry,
go ahead.
carry on.
I was just going to say, I think Ron Paul is the starting point, and because I was going through your Twitter earlier today, and I think the ending point is, and these are the guys that I've been reading recently, is the paleo libertarians, which overlapped with the Buchanan camp. So I think for people who are receptive to Ron Paul, that's great. I would like them to graduate towards Rothbard and Hoppe and so on. I think that's the natural progression for that movement. And, obviously, as you know, the libertarian psyche has its limitations, and a lot of them are pretty stubborn about that kind of stuff. I actually know someone at my university right now who's very pessimistic about the Mises guys, and those guys are bad news or whatever. But those guys are pretty cool, as you know.
I'll put it this way: I don't think they can win generally, but if they do, I'd be quite happy with it. Like I'm not gonna counter signal them, but I think that's a separate conversation, which I'm willing to have, but maybe not tonight. So Hoppe is actually a really interesting person for me. So there's kind of I have a weird mental Venn diagram, right? And honestly, like if I had to pick one active position I think that the right can really take, it is that kind of Hoppian localism. And there's kind of a weird Venn diagram between Rod Dreher's Benedict option, Ted Kaczynski, and then Hans Hermann Hoppe, who on most things have absolutely nothing in common. But there is kind of a call towards localism and reframing politics, not reframing, focusing more on small scale politics, which is kind of the things you can affect in your community. So do you see any kind of similarity there, or am I just completely like fabricating something out of whole cloth?
I think the localism is in the right direction. Obviously, as people get pessimistic about the cities and, the escalation of modernity, I think people are just starting to stick with a smaller network of people, which I think is natural. And I think where there's overlap with the people that you mentioned is it's sort of an extension of what I said earlier, getting away from the National Review crowd. Just obviously the GOP is feckless, and it's using the same playbook from the Cold War, and they can't adapt to the 21st century. And so, like, to something more comparable, like Rothbard's right-wing populism article, or strategy for the right. This sort of overlap with other camps that are not really out there in the public diet, so to speak, and sort of just using that to influence the influencers. I don't expect the libertarians to ever win, but if we can, the fact that those ideas are basically mainstream, even though they never really win an election, that kind of sentiment, I think, is going to be resonating with people as the years go on. And so that's what makes me optimistic about the future, even if we're not, winning out there in the open and getting credit for it. To me, that's not really the issue. It's about having those ideas normalized. And so I see that happening more and more frequently.
That's fair. Again, I think, and this is not a fully formed argument, so hear me out here. I think that I have become less and less convinced that there is a correlation between widely held beliefs and actions taken by society. And so I that very well may be true, but I don't necessarily see how that materially helps us, if that makes sense.
Which part of it?
Oh, sorry. So the idea that through this kind of gradual mainstreaming of what we could broadly say is more libertarian ideas, that will produce some type of change in the direction of society. Does that
Well,
make sense?
yeah, I think I see what you're saying. I think the fact that, because the way that I look at, like, the managerial state, there is still a relationship between the state and its people. Like,
Mm-hmm.
the State Department can't just do whatever it wants willy-nilly without any consequences, and I think they're aware of that concept. So, the fact that, like, they can't start a new war, at any given moment, I think that kind of shows you that a lot of that anti-war sentiment from the libertarian camp. And I mean, I don't even know if I want to give them all the credit. We could say that, like, anti-war is kind of a right-wing thing historically, or at least
Right.
throughout the 20th century. So I think that the fact that those ideas are sort of in somebody like Trump, who wasn't very effective as president, but he had that instinct. And so instilling people with that instinct moving forward, that's why I say it does kind of make its way through the door, and it sort of prevents more disaster where, probably like 15 years ago, people were just totally, uh, everything was a little more monolithic with the Bush administration, and people sort of ate up propaganda. And while the propaganda is a lot more explicit now, I do think, because with everything being more decentralized now, it's a lot easier to fool people, even though I'm very pessimistic about the masses. I do think a lot of them are kind of being pushed in a right-wing direction, whether they know it or not.
So that's a fair point. So one of the other topics I really wanted to address tonight was being a right-wing Zoomer, right? Like there's kind of this meme. I mean, even the term Zoomer is a meme, right? That basically anyone under 25 just kind of shuffles through a series of completely made up radical internet ideologies. So how would you describe being young and being on the right in this kind of weird corner of the internet?
Well, it's funny because a lot of the people that I was watching before I started to get interested in Buchanan, I don't know if I instinctively knew this, but I was a little weirded out by the fact that all these young influencers, pundits, Ben Shapiro, who's like 30 something, and Charlie Kirk, who's like 28. It's like even the youngest guys, and that's not even forget about like Dennis Prager, who's like 60 or something.
Right.
All these, David French, all these
Hmm.
writers and so on. It's all old guys. And so it's like, where's my representation in the online right? And as I mentioned before the show, obviously not a some people might write him off or scoff, but like someone like John Doyle, who is not really that controversial, but he'll cite like Sam Francis, or he'll talk about Carl Schmitt talking points, stuff like that. I think is gets people in the right direction. And so me, who was for like years now extremely online and just keeping up with all the drama and some of the pundits, to me that's always interested me and kind of normalized it. I've just been recently going to political conferences, and I'm seeing all the young people in person really makes me optimistic. I know not everybody does stuff like that, and maybe that's why people are black-pilled. They don't really see a lot of the progress that's happening because you go on Twitter and it's nothing but chaos. But for me, it's never really been that odd being a Zoomer because I've always kind of stuck with that crowd in group chats and so on. I just think we bring, much needed fun back into politics. If you don't mind, I kind of wanted to get into one particular event that I think kind of inspired me to keep checking out politics. Do you mind if I kind of tell a short story?
No, not at all. Time's all yours.
So, thank you. So, something that I think really captured my imagination was I was lucky enough to attend the Battle of Berkeley from 2017 at Berkeley, California. And
Oh, wow.
the fact that politics wasn't, Milton Friedman and like I said, the old guys club. This was sort of my vivid event that showed me that politics was trash TV. It was flashy, and so that's something that appealed to me going, even though a lot of these people are, have some baggage. I think just going to that event made me want to continue to investigate politics less from an analytical perspective and sort of embrace my Gen Z sensibility. And I was able to sort of host this event at my university in Fresno, which I think was titled Future of America, where I was able to host John Doyle, Kai Schwimmer from TikTok, who was banned, but just this whole vibe. I just think that's what politics should be. I know there's a lot of like philosophy channels, and people want to make the right into this elite that can counteract with the DC elite, and that's fine. I don't tell people to stop reading books or to not be serious all the time, but I really think moving forward, we should be careful to make this fun, make this like it was in 2016 Twitter, the Breitbart comments section. To me, this is the things that got me interested in politics. So that's always been my introduction since as a Zoomer.
Well, I very much know what you mean. I think just temperamentally, I do kind of trend towards that more like dour philosophical side of it. But there definitely is something to be said for like the right, especially in that 2016 time frame, and even now at certain degrees, was a fun place to be. Like even if you weren't as much into the more like extreme parts of it, like the the Trump, the run up to Trump was genuinely hilarious. And I
Yeah.
think that there was kind of this like mischievous attitude towards the whole thing where I think both of us, you weren't old enough to vote for Trump the first time around, were you?
No,
Yeah. So
unfortunately.
I missed it by just a few weeks. And I remember because I wasn't necessarily, there wasn't anything I could do. My attitude was very much like, all right, well, let's watch where this goes. And I remember waking up early, refreshing Google, being like, wait, what? And then after it sank in, I was like, well, off to the salt mines we go. And just opened up. I've kind of pulled back from most, kind of normie social media. But I was on Instagram at the time, and I just remember refreshing and just going through pages and pages of ostensible adults losing their minds. And obviously, there is a definite positive vision that I think is important on the right about promoting human flourishing and kind of indexing yourself towards reality that I don't mean to minimize. However, I can't also deny that it is very funny to watch people completely lose their mind. And I don't think you can make a movement out of only making people lose their mind, but it is something that I can't deny is very fun, right?
Right, and I think those compilation videos, the election results, I think that's what normalized a lot of right-wing thoughts that probably would have taken years of citations and books. I think for a lot of people, that was enough for them, and so that's why I emphasize the sense of humor, the Zoomer attitude, this sort of, controlled chaos that was happening on the internet, and I really revel in that, and ever since 2018 or 2019 rather, I've been trying to play catch up with, the blood sports and just all the lore that I missed because I wasn't online and paying attention at that time. And the arcs of YouTubers, and I know for some people this is, again, like I said earlier, this is trash TV, this is reality shows, that you can't build a movement around, Mr. Medicare or whatever, you know what I mean? But it's just I really can't let go of that aspect of politics, and so, yes, I encourage, these guys that are, R. and McIntyre and these guys that are really laying out, like, the books and the academic side of it, but, as you said, as a Zoomer, I do have to be honest with where my roots came from, so that's where I'm entering from.
So I'm curious. I found, by the way, the article about the the protest you managed to start in Fresno.
That's
So
right.
I'm curious because I think there was kind of a pre-baked narrative before you and I went to school. Because I graduated in 2017, so we were probably entering college at roughly the same time, and there was kind of a pre-baked narrative of what campus political culture was like. How much of that, when you arrived, did you feel prepared for, and how much of that really was a culture shock?
I wasn't really prepared at all. I would never, get involved with like a debate or try and prove the teacher wrong. That just wasn't me. I'm of the belief that, and this is I think where we contrast with some of the older people. I do think that college is something that young people should strive for. I think they can benefit from using those credentials to kind of shove ourselves in fields that they are trying to keep us out of. And yeah, so I would going to community college, my experience there, that was kind of the early stage of me investigating Pat Buchanan, Sam Francis, and so that was helpful, and I'm glad that I did that, and I think a lot of people can have that similar experience. Um, Now around a little after community college, it might have been the end or when I got into a university. The What really gave me some perspective was getting involved with a political campaign, and this is something I probably would not recommend, as I said with getting involved with college. At this point, I was interested, and you probably know Phyllis Schlafly, who
Mm-hmm.
that's somebody who I still think that's one of the most compelling people to recommend, especially to women. To be honest, I think that can really,
So before
yeah.
we go ahead, that is someone you probably need to introduce because I don't think that's as common a name, even in our circles, as Pat Buchanan or some of the other speakers we've referenced.
Sure. So Phyllis Schlafly was an activist in the early '70s. There was an amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment. In the aftermath of feminism, you had people like Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedman who wrote the Feminine Mystique, Miss Magazine. Those types were really infiltrating the culture, and they kind of had a monopoly on talking about issues, social issues. And so Phyllis Schlafly was the conservative counterpart, and she led a grassroots movement of, women and Christians to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment because if men and women are seen as equal, then that means, I mean, we understand this. It makes men and women, it degrades both sexes, and it's just in the long run, her argument was, women are going to get drafted into the military, and it was just going to have this effect that a lot of the feminists weren't listening to at the time. So she was one of these people that also was against like conservative Inc. She wrote a book talking about the Rockefeller Republicans differentiated from the early Reagan coalition, and so outlining that both parties are in on it, and you gotta kind of have this paleo conservative, anti rhino, whatever plug in, whatever a boomer would understand. So she was really one of the most underrated activists of, American 20th century politics. And there's actually a Hulu show after her. I think it's Miss America. So finding out about her, it's like, once again, this is somebody who I haven't heard about. I hear all day about Reagan and Thatcher and Milton Friedman and, you know, economic conservatism and so on. I don't hear a lot from the religious right, the moral majority. So that's what showed me that there's a other side of conservatism that can easily be receptive to young people. And so when I was getting involved with this political campaign, I'll just say it, the guy's name's David Valadeo, and he was a Republican that ran on like amnesty, or he was sympathetic to legal immigration. And this is when I was starting to become aware of like beautiful losers, the stupid party versus the evil party. Sam Francis is, you should never compromise in politics because it always runs against you. And so those ideas were in my head during this campaign, and it just sort of made me realize, wait a second, like you said, I saw the pessimistic attitude in the situation, and me being from California, that's the attitude with the GOP. It's this compromise attitude. So, that really got me interested. What started out as critiquing the two parties, the pundit class, it eventually turned into just total disdain for democracy. So that's how another step that got me into this part of the right.
Well, and that's an interesting point you bring up, that kind of like hidden canon, because I think that even at an early age, because my early political memories, I have obviously memories older than this, but are of kind of the like rising storm of Obama, and just kind of this feeling of like inevitable quote unquote hope and change, right? And I remember even as a child, right? I was in grade school at the time, looking around, and I was like, well, you guys can't win, not with this, like this isn't popular, telling people, you know, the infamous Mitt Romney, over half of people don't pay taxes, and that's a bad thing. Well, that might be true, but that's certainly not a winning proposition. Telling people you're going to have to pay taxes is not a particularly popular point. And I just remember sitting around and I was like, well, is this really it? Is the whole purpose of the political right just to act as kind of a speed bump in the way? Like the famous saying, standing aside. I can't remember the exact quote, right? But Buckley even says very much that, right? Like the purpose of the right is essentially to slow down the inevitable march of progress. And there is kind of this feeling to it, which is like, well, what's the point then? If the only purpose of my beliefs are to act as kind of a seasoning to someone else's, it's like, well, why always play defense? And then you read what supposedly the literature, like the things that are supposedly, the tomes of knowledge informing this, and it's trash, and if you've ever read anything else, you're like, well, this is terrible, and if the answer is like, oh, well, we should have just done the trash harder, you're like, well, this is terrible. This is a horrible idea. And so I very much know that feeling of kind of, pulling your head up and seeing, oh, wait, politics didn't start in 2001 or in 2004 or 2008. That there's a broader conversation to be had over time, and that there's more to be talked about and discussed than just kind of the at the time, which was essentially like the Sean Hannity talking points. And I remember that feeling kind of being liberating, right? That I didn't need to hitch my wagon. I knew that I couldn't be part of the left. That just wasn't in how I was raised. It isn't in my personality. But I remember the massive relief of, oh good, I don't have to hang out with these losers anymore. Because I think the phrase beautiful losers is great. It is this whole like cult of losing, but at least we lost with dignity. And you know what? There's definitely something to dignity. But if it's essentially a cult of losing on our own terms, that's not something that I think is particularly noble.
Right, and if everyone's losing, then it becomes radical to win, and so
Right.
that's
No, definitely. And I think that you see that even in people I don't particularly like. I'm not the biggest, I'm not the biggest Chris Rufo fan, but you see all of the like, all of the just feckless. I think the best term I've heard for them is the catamite right. Just screech and wail against someone who ostensibly is on their side, and you realize, well, wait a minute, you don't like him because he's not doing what you're supposed to do. He hasn't fit into the role. And I think it's interesting because you can kind of see people's priority, right, in how they define their friends and enemies. And going back to the libertarian circle, right? Like the big divide is always between, the Beltway libertarians and everyone else. And even though the tin says the same thing, right? On both cases it says libertarian. You look inside and okay, who are their friends and who are their enemies? And when you're a libertarian whose friends are the halls of power and enemies are everyone else, it turns out that even though you're labeled libertarian, you end up acting pretty much like the system you're supposed to, fight with every fiber of your being. And I think that's an endemic problem on the right that I think hopefully is something that's being fixed as kind of the rhinos or whatever you want to call them are being driven out.
Yeah, when you mention the Chris Rufo example, one of the things that makes me optimistic, and this is why people gotta stay on Twitter. I know a lot of people got purged and it's not the way it used to be, but I can't emphasize enough. People must stay on Twitter, even if it's just for the content. But there's a lot of recent developments that I think are pretty good wake-up calls for some people who are maybe still in doubt. One thing that comes to mind is you probably remember the Pedro Gonzalez, Douglas Murray debacle. Do you remember that?
I do, yeah.
So that being, Douglas Murray on paper is this, conservative who, back then the radical thing to do was to talk about, Muslim terrorism. And so he's got his credentials, hey, look, I'm edgy too. I can talk about stuff like that. But then when Pedro Gonzalez comes along and has some tweets that he finds offensive, all of a sudden, like you said, he's shrieking about, and he has this like reserved animosity for people that are, just making fun of him and making fun of how he looks. And it's just like it really says it all. The fact that, and one specific part of that is, you probably know Claire Lehman or Layman, whatever, from Quillette. That was another one who went after Pedro because he like misspelled her name or something in an article. And it's like, this is an article that's talking about how she's a fraud. You're a neocon. You're not. You go the speed limit with conservatism, and it's just like these people have no answer to that. They just wage war against other people on the right. Like I said earlier, they exist to control the conversation, and that just can't happen anymore. We're not going to win that way. So people seeing stuff like that on the timeline and seeing two people on the supposed right fight, I think that infighting kind of gets us to a synthesis and helps us out in the long run. I think it paves a lot of inroads, for people like Academic Agent or any handful of channels that use these talking points. Aaron McIntyre, those people show support for people like Pedro who are taking slings and arrows from the establishment, from neocons, and I think they're winning online. I kind of wanted to mention James Lindsay at some point, so I guess I can say that right now. To me, that was the perfect example. of a guy who just was not expecting the online right to rise up against him. And I think we saw, just like I said with the libertarians or in the Tea Party, we are tech savvy. We got the citations and we're ready to debate at a moment's notice. These guys live in, DC echo chambers. They like JD Vance. They surround themselves with these advisors and so on, and they don't really have their roots with the people. So that's why I think things are going in our direction. These people can sort of, reveal these people from right in front of the public square, which is Twitter.
So I guess that's a question that I have, because I don't disagree with you on what is left of right-wing Twitter, right? Things are swinging in our direction. But I guess I am unsure as to how you, and I don't mean you literally, right? But bridge the gap between that kind of like, if you want to use the old language of 2016, right? The meme magic, and then the kind of like hard and fast reality. Because at least how I see it is that the failing of the kind of like, if you want to call it like the skeptics or whatever, was kind of the, what was not quite the right, but more of the right of the kind of like 2014 to 2018, was that there was this online conversation that to a certain extent the online debate was quote unquote won, but that nothing really ever came of it. And I don't mean to be overly impatient, like maybe that the thing that came or will come from that movement hasn't arrived yet, or it paved its way for something else. But to me, I guess I don't see how that win online translates to a real substantive win.
Yeah, it's a lot of the victories have been online, but I don't think it stays there, because one of the things that exposes, having the online rights ratio, a candidate out in the open, is I think a lot of that translates to when these people do a Q&A event at a conference, and their game is sort of unveiled in front of the public square. I think just a lot of these people can't win, and whereas maybe 15 years ago, a rhino, a neocon, someone like Mitt Romney probably could have won people over. That trick that politicians would do like 100 years ago, where because there's no internet, they can literally just like use the same script from town to town, and no one's going to catch on because no one's probably going to out them. But today, with everything being under the media eye, I just feel like that has an advantage to it. And I think those people aren't going to win their elections, to tell you the truth. I think a lot of that animosity online, the way that politicians would get kind of embarrassed in like 2008, if you remember, I think our version of that can be, you know, having these news outlets that are sympathetic to us say, hey, look at this list of stuff that he said that totally goes against his values. And I do think a lot of it doesn't stay online. I think that can easily get into the media. I look at something like Revolver Magazine, which technically isn't really connected to the DC circuit, but it's people that are talking about things the way they are, and it's getting circulation, and it gets on like Tucker, for example. And so I would say that's an example of sort of how our message kind of bleeds into the real world, if that makes sense.
No, that's fair. And I do think that if you could find one way in which the kind of online right is connected to, at least in any way, the real halls of power, I think that Tucker is the way, right? At least the way that it's happening now. I mean, I haven't been following it closely, but it seems like that he did a little mini doc on kind of the the raw egg nationalist part of the right, which I'll be perfectly honest, I don't really understand. It seems
Me
like they're
too.
having fun. I
Me
don't
too.
understand how much of it is a joke. I mean, sunning your balls seems like an odd choice. I'm not going to say I'm against it. But again, to me, that's one of those things where I guess, and this is just maybe natural pessimism or something else, but I guess I don't I don't see how, if we're going to take the kind of the GRU meme, right, of pointing at the poster board. It's like we've got step one, which is, filter ideas to Tucker. Step two, question mark, and step three, profit. It's that middle part that I'm kind of unsure on, right? And again, like I'm not to denigrate the fact that ideas which would have been completely outside of the Overton window, even 4 or 5 years ago, are now something that can be discussed on the biggest show on cable television. Right? I'm not going to deny that that's from a certain perspective, a win. But I also don't know how you square that with the last, shall we say, 2.5 years, where kind of by hook or by crook, the public has been essentially forced into a bizarre state of servitude. And I will speak very carefully about the events that caused that, right? I fully trust and believe in science. I have my, Dr. Fauci votive candle. But you understand what I'm saying, right? Which is that it seems like if that avenue had power, we would have seen it by now.
Well, I do think a lot of things are just possible right now. I even think to stay optimistic, I think about how 2016 was not supposed to happen that way. Trump was not supposed to get in there, and all these journalists that write frantically about people on the online rights, that's supposed to have enough power to delegitimize people, and I just see that them losing their grip. I see a lot of people that, aren't supposed to be allowed in DC because they're not from this city, sort of them looking down at the working class and so on. I see that attitude losing popularity when I see it on the timeline. And I think that that easily translates to, the boomers who are still an important voting bloc. And I just think it's a matter of getting them on board to that kind of a platform, because I mean, we'll see what happens in this primary 2024, whatever you want to say. I think a lot of these ideas are just slowly building momentum in the background, and I think that's when you start to get the beginning of another Tea Party-esque Ron Paul revolution. Only this time, I think, what we're learning from the mistakes of 2020, and we're learning from the limitations of Trump, who was obviously not an ideologue. I think that it takes a lot of failures to kind of shape up this new right that is less feckless.
Well, I hope you're right. Again, like I said, I don't know if I'm convinced, but I hope you're right. So I'm curious, what is it like to be someone on the right in what's quite possibly the epicenter of whatever you want to call it, the pause, right? Because obviously you are very much in unfriendly territory.
Do you mean like in California, or like?
Yes, yeah. Well, at a university in California, right?
Sure. Well, like on campus, I don't really get any flack. I will say, all the cliches you hear about, they are true. It's not just talk. California is probably worse than the stuff people hear, and that doesn't discourage me or make me want to drop out. But I don't know, when my background is also kind of interested in music, so when I look at Los Angeles, I do see a lot of like musical history there that still resonates with me. But as far as like the political climate, one of the things I learned from hanging out with that campaign team is just, and maybe this translates across the country, but it seems like a lot of boomers, the next step is going to be getting them to hate democracy, or dislike democracy rather, because one thing that happens specifically in California, and for those that remember the Larry Elder run for office, you know, people think that it's cool that all these boomers that just live around here can just run for office, and it's a big slush fund for them to raise money, and if they don't win, that's okay, because at least they gave it their best effort. And it's like, California going blue for years has set us back so much. We're gonna have to lose like multiple elections before we get the grassroots to where it can compete, anywhere near an election cycle. So I just think that like I mentioned with Phyllis Schlafly, people really need to understand that it's not a matter of voting for the right person. Like you said with the localism, that has to come first before we can even think about sending somebody up there to represent us. I just think people need to contextualize that, and the nuances of politics I don't think are all crystal clear for boomers, and definitely not for young people. That might be the next step moving forward, and that's something that probably needs to be set across national lines. This anti-democracy stuff is not just a meme. Like, that really gets at the heart of how we can win and win people over. So I see that as the next fight. I see that as something that we're gonna have to eventually get to, and right now, it seems like we're in a wait and see process, but as far as, like, what to expect moving forward, that one, I can't wait for that to grab headlines.
That's fair. I think that one of the things that I wonder, and I'm not expecting you to have an answer to this off the bat, which is if we kind of accept the framing of, maybe not currently, but kind of, let's just say the post FDR era of kind of the right just consistently taking L's, with notable blips in the opposite direction, right? If you are the type of person who is kind of willing to violate the rules of the system in order to take power, right? Like, ostensibly, taking an anti-democratic position is against the quote unquote rules of the game, right? If we're going to take that framing device. But if you're it seems to me, right, if you are the type of person who is at least on some level, a Machiavellian actor, I don't understand why you join Team Red. Why do you join the losing side? And one thing that I've been thinking about, and maybe this is the opening, right? That is, as kind of the central power of the US government wanes, which it seems like, at least at the very peripheries, it is. The outer provinces are kind of pulling away. That maybe that opens up the opportunity for kind of, based DeSantis con of Florida. Kind of a joke, but you know what I mean, right? That opens up the opportunity for people to, make those kind of non-democratic moves. Because I mean, look at even over our lifetimes, right? Like, the idea that essentially a fairly populous state could essentially tell the central government to, go pound sand. It's kind of absurd. And to be fully fair, I think that the first kind of moves in this direction were by blue states, which oddly kind of provided them cover, right? It was mostly with marijuana. And then weirdly enough, we had that kind of bizarre time in the 2010s when it seemed like ranchers could get away with pointing guns at the feds, which was kind of a fun digression. But it does seem like that there is a greater opportunity as central power weakens for other people to, kind of carve up their slice of the pie. And maybe that's what, and again, I'm kind of workshopping this out aloud. Maybe that is what we need to kind of incentivize people to kind of join Team Red. That maybe that is the path to victory. Because I think that if you are someone, and maybe this person doesn't exist, who is that kind of, more Machiavellian, the kind of person who would break the rules of the game, kind of move in a more non-democratic direction. Maybe that's the thing that motivates you to join the other team, because as of now, how I look at it, all the incentives kind of go in one direction. Does that make sense as a framing device?
Yeah, I think what you're describing is like a Huey Long strategy.
Right. Yes, very much so.
Yeah, that is interesting, and I think even introducing people like that just to give them a fair hearing, I think that creates a lot of possibilities for candidates moving forward. Like I said, I think the California model, and it's probably doesn't originate there, but just these people that just run that don't have a chance, but you try to do your best, I guess, because you're campaigning for them or whatever. I think the DeSantis model, I think, is palatable. The fact that, like, Florida is seen as, like, this epicenter that's making all the other states look bad, maybe that's kind of the selling point for some people. Because I always think about the flyover states. I know that, like, it might be easier to, subvert from by joining, Team Blue, but I don't find that very like, I don't think that's gonna work in the long run. Because I think the left is probably a little harder to gatekeep or rather to kinda infiltrate that as opposed to the right. I think the right, there's a couple of spaces where, like a Huey Long type could kinda find a home there, you know? I don't see people on the left tolerating, someone who's read like Carl Schmitt or something among their ranks. I do see, like, the right as the side to do that in, but, yeah, as far as, like, a candidate, our American Caesar, I don't know who's shaping up to be that, I'm not sure, to be honest.
And I think that I'm in a similar position, right? Like if I knew, I wouldn't be here, having an anonymous stream on the internet. But I think I'm going to wrap things up. I'm pretty tired. Thank you so much, Ace, for meeting me, so late and at such, little notice. So if you could just give your plugs, then we can get out of here.
Sure, sure. You can find me at Aaron Ryder AC on Twitter and on YouTube, Loud Sound Epicenter, where I host a show with Thomas 777. So yeah, I have a Substack that I basically neglect. It's in the community section, I think, on the YouTube channel. So those are my main platforms.
All right. Well, thanks, Ace. And I'm going to end it now. Thanks for appearing with me.
Thank you, man.
All right. Talk to you later.
Later.